think marijuana and cannabis in general is something that it transcends both party lines on this. It's not necessarily just a Republican issue. That the success really boils down to what kind of organized opposition is going to have. And so in 2014, the first medical marijuana amendment in Florida failed. There was a lot of organized opposition and a lot of money that went into that.
Welcome to Practical Politics, the podcast that takes you inside the room where decisions actually happen. I'm Sabrina Noah, the lobbyist lady, bringing you conversations with the people who live and breathe politics and policymaking process.
Hi, it's Sabrina Noah, the lobbyist lady, and welcome back to Practical Politics. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome my friend John Lockwood from the great state of Florida. John is the founding attorney of the Lockwood Law Firm and one of the state's leading experts in highly regulated industries such as alcohol, cannabis, gambling, and healthcare. Known for his sharp public policy strategies and trusted relationships throughout Florida's executive agencies, John is an absolute pro at getting to the bottom line of an issue. When he's not advocating for effective business policy, he enjoys life on a farm outside of Tallahassee with his partner Anna, spending time outdoors and collecting vintage Toyota Land Cruisers. John, thank you so much for joining us on Practical Politics. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful, Sabrina. I'm very glad to make an appearance on this podcast with you.
Thank you. What have you been up to today? Tell us a little bit about where you are.
So today I'm working from the farm. So this is kind of a structure that I built. As you know, I live in the middle of nowhere. And we've built this to basically be a couple of different things. I've got an office here. I collect, obviously, the Land Cruisers. I got a few in the back. Got an arcade, a gym, and other things. I mean, I'm pretty remote here, so this was built.
I haven't heard about the gym before.
Yeah, the gym is a necessity. You got to have some things to work some stress out a lot of times when dealing with governmental agencies. So it's good to stay in shape and also. And again, we're in the middle of nowhere and not really close to anything, so it's nice. This is kind of my home base. So, but we do have an office in Tallahassee, and that's where the other partners of the firm reside. So.
John, tell us a little bit about your farm.
Yeah, so this is kind of this area of the country is known as the Red Hills, and so it's basically I'm right here on the state line. I'm in Florida, but I share about a 1.5 mile border with the state of Georgia. These are all generally old quail hunting plantations, old families that have had these for generations.
John, tell me what drew you into the world of lobbying. What's the story behind the founding of the Lockwood Law Firm?
So when I went to law school, I really knew nothing about lawyers. I mean, I grew up in a family. I was the only one to graduate from college at the time and law school at the time. But I went to law school really just to get out of Alabama. It was something that I wanted to do. I was a psychology major, and when I graduated with a psychology major, I really didn't have a whole lot of options. So the idea was, let's go to law school. Gives me a few more years to figure this out. Ended up in Tallahassee, state capital of Florida, did a little bit of work in the legislature, and it just opened my eyes to, a whole new area of legal work. I think when I started law school, I thought of, people were personal injury attorneys, corporate lawyers, things of that nature. And I realized that there was this other little niche area of the law for regulated industries because, there was a lot of opportunities with the legislature, the executive branch, lawsuits, things that may spin out of that. So it really, for me, I'm inherently a problem solver. That's what I want to do. And so, realizing with clients in these industries, there were just so many different ways I could help clients, through that and, either lobbying with the legislative branch or potentially, working through a solution with the executive branch. And so, yeah, that really starting in the Florida legislature was what spun things out and ultimately into the creation of my own firm.
Would you say that your first real professional job was the Florida legislature?
I worked for free in that job just to really get an opportunity there. It was very interesting working with the legislative committee, and so from there I worked with still in law school. I worked with a lobbying firm that is now a really large lobbying firm in Florida. out of law school, I went straight to the Attorney General's office, and Charlie Crist at that time was the Attorney General. I was only there for a very short period of time. He became governor that within a few months after I started at the Attorney General's office, and my supervising attorney, he became an appellate court judge on Florida's First District Court of Appeals and wanted me to come be his chief law clerk.
Wow.
And that was very interesting for me because that appellate court hears
Hmm.
essentially every regulatory dispute in Florida. And so I
Wow.
learned an exceptional amount of knowledge in that and gained an enormous amount of experience. And from there, I went into private practice. I was with a small boutique firm in Florida, in Tallahassee, and then jumped out on my own. I was always very, entrepreneurial, wanted to, I don't think that I ever really dreamed that I would have my own firm, but it was just something that just happened. It made sense at the time and it was the right time. Um,
Hmm.
and so that started around 2010.
Is there a particular moment, either in your career or with your family, when it really clicked for someone what your work as a regulatory and problem solver looks like?
So around 2010, I started working on a project for a client who really they wanted to create a new facility for gaming in Miami, downtown Miami specifically. Um, I was able to leverage a 30-year-old law that had really hasn't been used in 30 years to
Hmm.
create a new gaming permit for them.
Hmm.
It's called a summer highlight permit, which is kind of a subset of a regular of highlight fronton, and that's an old Spanish game, which really nobody plays highlight anymore. But having the highlight permit allows you to get the additional gaming activities. Those
John, do I have
permits,
it correct that the new way that casinos grow is by adding new games, right? It's hard to get a new
correct,
building, so you grow by adding new games.
correct. That most jurisdictions want to keep everybody into the existing
Mm.
footprint. So there
Hmm.
was a hard line in Florida about creating new facilities and new
Got it.
permits. This new permit, ultimately through me and some others, after we got this approved, allowed so many things, and it truly changed the gaming landscape in Florida through new facilities that were able to open, and also it allowed other facilities to change from like thoroughbred racing to have a highlight permit, and that saved them a significant amount of money in operational expenses. And so for me, that was unique because I was able to not only start that process, but basically live through it because after the first permit was issued, the state really cracked down on these and they did not want to give any more out. But the legislature refused for actually for 11 years to close that loophole. They wouldn't close the
Wow.
loophole, but the
Mm.
executive branch agency was trying to do everything they could to stop them from being issued. So we had, I argued cases in the First District Court of Appeals, the Third District Court of Appeals. We had something in the Fourth District Court of Appeals. And so all of these cases spun out of this. And then, after a few years, the legislature came in. I mean, and so, going back to where we initially started, this was something that seemed, so innocent at the beginning, but it touched, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, the executive branch, all out of this, one particular issue. A lot of press was generated on it. And again, it truly just changed the gaming landscape in Miami-Dade and Broward County, Florida.
What are all the different types of gambling that is allowed? Because I learned so much through casino gambling, uh, slot machine gambling,
Yeah.
game card gambling.
So gambling has certainly evolved over the years. Ironically, um, almost one of the original form of gamings was pinball machines. That was something that's now regulated in a lot of jurisdictions, and it
Interesting.
started in Chicago, and it was just a skill-based form of gaming that people would
Mm.
come in and play. And so, specific to Florida, we initially started with parimutuel betting, which would be, horse racing, dog racing. Dog racing is now prohibited in Florida. High life frontons, in the mid 90s, those type of gaming activities were struggling primarily due to another form of gaming in Florida called the Florida Lottery. It was just
Mm.
something for people to bet on, and so people weren't going to the horse tracks anymore. They were going to the gas stations and picking up lottery tickets. And so the legislature came in and created the authorization for these facilities to have poker. So we have so many poker rooms now in Florida, but they're all tied to the historical parimutuel wagering facilities. So horse tracks, dog tracks. In 2004, there was a local or a statewide referendum in Florida to allow slot machine gaming in Dade and Broward County. So we had that. Since then, gaming has now morphed from the typical brick and mortar that you would think of to we have online sports betting, we have daily fantasy sports. And here recently now we've seen a boon in sweepstakes gaming, which are people are trying to use the laws that were intended to, if you remember Monopoly, the Monopoly game at
Hmm.
McDonald's, right? So most state
Yeah.
laws regulate those sweepstakes games. And now operators have come in and tried to piggyback off those very limited exceptions to allow forms of online sweepstakes. And those have become very popular, but
Interesting.
also very litigious in a lot of jurisdictions because states are saying this was never what these laws were intended to. But I
Yeah.
mean, these companies are making hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, on an annual basis on these online activities. So it's certainly a very lucrative but highly regulated area of the law.
Well, as we talk about the laws of unintended consequences, speaking about gambling, what I learned in that segment was that the reason that we have gambling in Florida is because of pinball from Chicago. So, just another interesting fact about Florida. Uh,
Very true.
obviously, regulate highly regulated industries is your expertise, right? You're really good at finding that way to intersect business and policy and kind of make agencies happy at the same time. How does somebody from a gambling background, right, which is super highly regulated, find
Sure.
their way into the cannabis space? So tell me a little bit about your first cannabis client or how you decided to enter the cannabis space and what that felt like.
What I've found in my practice over the years is that there are just a certain type of investor and operator that is drawn to a regulated industry. They like the certainty of knowing that, there's a limited number of licenses. They like the certainty of knowing that what they're doing is perfectly permissible by state law. And so, when Florida authorized the first medical marijuana program in 2014, and then it's evolved since then, I had a lot of clients that were interested in getting in that business. And I was fortunate enough to represent one of the winners of the initial 5 licenses in Florida. Um, and so that licensee went from, they were a very small operation, but they got acquired by a public company. And that was kind of a big deal in Florida at the time because no one else had went public. And so I worked with them on that process. And once they went public, a lot of other groups that were interested started kind of coming to us and saying, look, I mean, you've obviously are gathering a lot of experience in working in these, this area here. And not a lot of people
Mhm.
were working before OMMU. And so we just started adding to the roster and just gaining more and more experience and seeing more and more things. And I think that's part of the big benefit to us now is just we've gained so much experience in representing so many people in so many different transactions before OMMU. And that's Florida's Office of Medical Marijuana Use.
John, when you're approaching highly regulated industries, what do you think are some of the benefits or some of the creative strategies that you bring to the table?
You know, I think from my perspective, I'm always very selective about the clients that I take. Number one, I really go through great pains to understand, where the client wants to go, where they've come from,
Mhm.
what kind of limitations they may have, things of that nature. I've seen it in experience too many times where people get into engagements with lawyers or lobbyists or whatever and just they get driven down this path that maybe they didn't realize what was actually going to happen at the end of the day and what that path may look like. And so for me, I always want to understand, when a client comes to me and say, this is what I'm looking to accomplish. I think number one, I always want to try to determine is that even possible? And if it is possible, making sure that that's something that the client may want to entertain. Is it going to require litigation? What that may look like? Are we going to have lobbyists involved? What that may look like? What's
Mhm.
there going to be the relationship with OMMU? Is this something that they're going to support? Is this something that if we could we get it, but is it really going to be worth it? Right? Is it going to burn the
Yeah.
relationship with OMMU? On that or
Yeah.
any other executive branch agency. And so I just, For me, it's, when I was growing up, I worked in a small business with my parents, and I think that just having that experience and understanding of really what's best for the client, what's going to serve their needs the best. Because at the end of the day, all I really want is happy, successful clients. And if I feel like I can't deliver that, then, I want to make sure the client understands that on the outset. And I also want to make sure that if I can deliver that, that it's going to be an experience that's worthwhile for the client. And so, that's a very in-depth process, but it also requires a lot of just institutional knowledge with these agencies and who you're working with, and can you sell this to the agency on, is this something that they're gonna want to get in with as well.
I will say, in my experience interviewing lobbyists here on Practical Politics and in my career, I have found that those lobbyists who have experience in either running or operating a small business really make fantastic lobbyists because they understand the laws of those unintended consequences, right? They understand how your decisions and how you behave with the regulator can impact the bottom line. So that's wonderful. I want to get us back to Florida, though. I got backtracked because I think that's so wonderful. But we're all hearing about Florida potentially preparing for the second round two of this cannabis adult use ballot referendum. This is a big deal. How are you thinking that we've learned? How are you feeling about the next ballot initiative? Are there lessons learned from past initiatives? Like, are we ready?
I think we're ready. um Florida is certainly an interesting animal. I mean, it's a massive state. To be successful, we've got to have 60%, which is not normal for most jurisdictions. Most jurisdictions, when
Yeah.
you a constitutional ballot, would require a 50% approval. Ironically, when Florida amended its constitution to have this to require 60%, that amendment to take it from 50% to 60% didn't gather 60% anyway. So it was able to slide in, but under today's standard, it wouldn't pass anyway. So 60% is tough in this day and age. I mean, you understand politics. Most issues, 60% of
Hmm.
people don't agree with. But I think
Yeah.
marijuana and cannabis in general is something that it transcends both party lines on this. It's not necessarily just a Republican issue. That
Uh-huh.
the success really boils down to what kind of organized opposition you know
Hmm.
is going to have. And so in 2014, the first medical marijuana amendment in Florida failed. There was a lot of organized opposition and a lot of money that went into that. But that group came back in 2016 and were actually successful because there was not a significant amount of opposition at that point in time. And you went from something that couldn't even get 60% to something that got well over 70% of the vote. So,
Mm.
I think now I don't necessarily want to say that, anything went wrong with the last, initiative in 2024, but there was a lot of money that was spent, opposing that. And that's unusual for these type of issues. So I don't know that we're really going to see that in 26. There's going to be different things that are going to be in play. We've got obviously a different president now. And it's not going to be a presidential election. This is going to be a midterm election. I don't know that the governor, and we're going to have a gubernatorial election going on at the same time. So I don't know that cannabis is going to get the negative energy, push toward it that it did in 2024. So, we'll see. I mean, I'm certainly very optimistic that, the second time is going to be what takes us over that threshold.
What are some ways that people can be either more aware or more involved in the 2026 ballot initiative or ballot referendum? How can people be helpful on this question?
I think the biggest thing is just, getting the word out to, peers, family, friends, things of that nature. What people, I think, fail to understand is we have cannabis in Florida today, really through two different parallel paths here. We've got a medical program that's enacted pursuant to a constitutional amendment, and we have the hemp CBD program, which is done through the exemptions in the federal farm bill.
Yeah.
We have a
Yeah.
lot of cannabis that can be bought in Florida. You can do, through a regulated MMTC market with a patient card, and you can do it, without a patient card. And, there's hemp shops, there's the vape shops, gas stations. I mean, there's a lot of cannabis that gets sold in the state of Florida. And essentially, at the end of the day, all this initiative does is ensure that if you're in the medical program or you're purchasing from those groups that have been licensed in the medical program, you don't have to get a patient card, because
Hmm.
what we hear a lot of times is that that adds a lot of money and cost to someone who's interested in becoming a cannabis user, especially, lower income people, people that are on,
Hmm.
small fixed incomes, of veterans, things of that nature. You've got a $75 annual fee, plus you've got
Yeah.
approximately $300 to $400 a year that you're spending in, just the hard cost of visiting the physician, right?
Yeah. It's not an easy process. It's curious. I really love how you talk about that. Florida, like many states, faces a lot of challenges around the definition of regulation in hemp and cannabis, right? The state and federal situation, the conflict is incredibly challenging. But I love how you phrase that there is a lot of cannabis in Florida. It's just there needs to be more licensed access, whether it's under the classifications of hemp or cannabis. What I think you're helping us understand, John, is that there is a desire for expanded access and more products, that Floridians really like THC.
Absolutely. I mean, there's almost 800 licensed cannabis dispensaries in the state of Florida just under the medical program alone. I don't know how many retail shops are selling the CBD and THC vapes, already. But again, there are, really two different programs and two avenues for people to get cannabis in the state of Florida.
If our listeners wanted to get more information from the campaign, or follow along and figure out how to get involved, where should they be getting more information about the ballot referendum in 2026?
So I would go to smartandsafeflorida.com. That is the website for the ballot initiative. And there's a lot of information on that website. And I know that they have social media and everything else on there to help, get out the message for people, help people figure out how they could get involved, how they could help, things of that nature.
Another interesting thing I learned about Florida is that you actually have to have your political contributions in before session starts. That's something that's very unique.
Yeah, so Florida, yeah, we cannot raise any money during the 60 days the legislature is in session. So a lot of the fundraising happens in Tallahassee. It gets, very busy in committee weeks and things like that, because when the legislature is in town, everyone has to go through that. And, luckily over the years, I mean, I certainly do, contribute money, but I'm not a bundler of the sorts. So raising, I don't use my clients to raise money or anything like that. So luckily that's something that I do stay out of.
Other than casino work and gambling, other than gambling and cannabis, are there any other favorite policy stories that you think best represent some of the work that you've gotten to do in Florida?
So I've had, some interesting ones over the years. I think one that stands out is I was representing a client that sold the ignition interlock devices. So when people get DUIs, they have to blow in this
Mm.
to start their car, right? And so I was representing someone where Florida had a law that we would just give this monopoly to two people, two companies throughout the whole state, and they would have little kiosks all around the state. Um, Long story short, I got hired by someone who was not in the two that were selected. And so I was able to realize that my client, this was we do government contract procurement, is really what this is part of in Florida. My client lost the procurement. And I realized there's no way we were going to win the procurement. We didn't score that high. And I'm not even sure why I think that it was just an issue with who they had prepare the application. But I realized
Mhm.
quickly the state had no authority whatsoever to limit this to two people. In almost every other jurisdiction in the state where my client and all these others operated, there's a federal NHTSA requirement. And if your device meets the federal NHTSA requirement in most jurisdictions, you just
Mhm.
have the ability to operate.
Yeah.
So again, starting from the beginning, I asked the client, I said, look, I mean, I can spend a contract procurement in Florida would cost 250, 350, $400,000 or more to litigate, because it's all hands on deck, 90 days, we're going to a final hearing. I said, well, what if we just ignore that proceeding and just file a lawsuit that the state can't award to, that they have to basically license everybody that certifies it? The client was like, that'd be fantastic. Is that even possibility? That's what we want to do. And so what was funny about that, Sabrina, is we essentially just ignored the whole bid procurement proceeding that was going on and filed a rule challenge and won on the rule challenge. And then we ultimately won on appeal. Um, and worked out great for the client. It was fantastic. And they were just that was one of the more rewarding things I think at that time, and that was probably 10 years ago now. But I think about that case a lot because that certainly was, one of those moments where, again, I most people, and there were other, I think there were 8 other parties that were in this litigation, and by the time our rule challenge had started, and all these attorneys started jumping ship and saying, wait a second, this is the path we need to go. We need to be over here with this guy challenging this rule because it's the deck is almost always stacked against you in a procurement lawsuit. And they knew that they weren't going to win over there. And the only challenge, or the only ability to gain any business in Florida, would be, let's just blow the system up. And so I love the opportunity and relish the opportunity to do something like that when we just completely change the way things are being done in the state. Very rewarding experience.
Sounds like regulatory law is bombastic creativity with a little bit of swagger in your case.
Love it.
I
Yeah.
love that. Are you a window or an aisle guy when you travel?
Definitely an aisle guy. I hate asking people to get up if I have to use the restroom or check my bag or something like that. So I'm definitely an aisle guy.
And I thought you were going to say, no, I fly private when I feel like it. But, I learned something new.
I mean, well, that wasn't really the question, but yeah, I mean, for given the first opportunity, I'm going to check and see if I've got a client that's going somewhere so I can bum a ride on their plane.
What keeps you motivated during a losing streak?
That's a great question, actually, because I think about that sometimes. Especially in this day and age with the way the legislatures regulate on things and the discretion that they give the agencies. Sometimes you can get into a little bit of a losing streak on something. But I think for me, I always think of, look, I'm fighting the good fight. If we keep going on, we're going to prevail. And I would say generally, if I've got a client that says, look, we have to win, no matter what, we have to win, I very rarely lose. One way or the other, we're going to get there through. It may be difficult, but if I've got a client that says we have to win by all costs, we generally get there. There's always limitations sometimes, but I certainly, and we do a fair amount of pro bono work too. I think that
Yeah.
that's also very, very rewarding for us, especially in, cannabis and casino. All of the individual employees have to go through background screening.
Mhm.
And a lot of times there's issues that come up that, and we see this a lot where, and what started it is we were seeing individuals that would come before these agencies and get denied. My partners and I would say, well, gosh, if they'd have just had an attorney, right? If they'd have just had an attorney, they could have gotten over the hump there and they could have given the agency what they wanted. And so we've done that a few times. We actually had one last week who came into town, gave us a couple of bottles of wine because he had actually moved to Florida from another jurisdiction. And this gentleman had been licensed everywhere, but Florida denied him for what I felt was kind of a silly thing. He was going to lose his job.
Yikes.
He'd bought a house, but we were able to get the guy licensed within a matter of weeks. Did it for free. Very rewarding. So those things help balance out some of the losses too.
I love that. And I love that you do some pro bono work. Thinking back to your story about a professional win, right? And not thinking about the details of why you won, but just thinking about that moment. What is that moment when you knew you were doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing? We all have that moment in our career where we're sitting around a room at a table and we're leading or participating and we're like, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be at the right time, at the right place. Do you have that moment?
So I had another case that I was involved in that was it was in the gaming space, and it was something that we had created this industry of sorts without the legislature, but through an administrative rule. Um, and then the administration changed, and they no longer liked what we'd been
Happens.
doing, and so we were facing, truly, it was bet the company litigation at that point in time. And we had several different lawsuits that were going on. And the first one I lost. And it was a crushing defeat to me. And I felt like I'd let everybody down. But we had a companion case, right? We had this other parallel case that was going on, and the judge had not
A
ruled.
second chance.
The second chance. And so about almost 30 days later, that ruling came in, and that ALJ or administrative law judge actually had cited the first case and basically disregarded it, ruled everything in our favor. And it was a huge, just a monumental victory at that point in time, because not only was it just great for the clients, but we had actually won a case that there really was no case law on. And it was something that was just almost charted new territory in Florida for challenging a rule. Um, and I think that one, not only was it just from the client's perspective, and we had quite a few. It was almost an entire industry that was behind this, because they needed it. If we did not have that today in that industry, a lot of these businesses would no longer be operational. And so for me, being able to prevail on that, and just the novel legal issue and the theory that we won on, and then
Mhm.
to be able to go, that the state, they did not like the ruling, so they appealed it, and so I was able to argue that in an appellate court. And so it was great. And I mean, you see me as I do a lot of, interaction with the agency, and we have a lot of deep relationships. But at the end of the day, I really do love arguing cases, and I really do love, like, really good legal issues to get into. Those are things that really, at the end of the day, I think is what makes me tick, is having the ability to just take control over a situation, being able to argue the case. And it really just feels good. You think about, like, a quarterback, or a basketball player, you want the ball at the end of the game, right? Like, I really
Yeah,
hate
give me
being,
the ball.
you know, just an observational person, and that's, going back to, getting involved with clients. I think that's, I want to understand my role at the end of the day. I mean, I think if I can't be point on something, I don't always say no, but I also think it's important to have the ability to, you know, be in control at the end of the day, and it be your theory that's moving the ball along, per se.
So to set that up one more time, you were working with the court, you were working with a client on a brand new course on a new case law. You were working with a client, you lost the first round, and then when you went back on the second round, they used the first case to prove that you won.
They basically
I
said
mean, that's kind of pretty cool.
it was great. We isolated the first case and said that, look, that was a very, specific factual situation that did not apply really to the legal merits of the case. And at the end of the day, the ALJ said, well, maybe they were doing something wrong at that point in time, but it doesn't undercut the legal authority of them to conduct these games at all. And so that judge ruled that the agency had no authority to take the games away from us. And so that was a huge, huge win at that point in time. And what's funny is I still cite that case a lot of times for, issues dealing with agencies, to say, hey, look, this is an important case you got to be mindful of. And, we prevailed. We got awarded attorney's fees. It was a great win.
You literally proved the exception proves the rule.
Correct. Correct.
That is a pretty big career highlight, and the ability to go back to the regulator. And one of the things I think that you excel at, right? And one of the things that all of the lobbyists that come to practical politics, there's a difference between taking the win and throwing a parade. And there's a difference between taking that win and walking back into the agency that you're trying to work with and being like, so you remember how we lost last week? Well, we
Yeah.
won this week.
Yeah.
And I'm here to help you figure out how we're going to move forward, right? Because at the end of the day, I think that's what the best lobbyists do, is they understand that your business partner is the regulatory agencies, your client, both of you guys need that client to be successful, to be there. In our prep, you quoted a crazy statistic that I cannot get out of my head, and I know you know what it's going to be, but could you remind me how much in fees the Office of Medical Marijuana, the Florida's cannabis regulator, collects every year?
So they collect, we've got almost 900,000 patients times $75 per patient a year. So that's almost, what, $70 million of fees that they collect off the patients.
Pretty big business for the regulator. And I know they take their job seriously, but I do just think it's helpful for people to understand that when we're talking about regulated industries and regulators, their budgets, we're talking big, big, big companies, big business.
It is. It certainly is. And, you'd mentioned about the, going back in after a win with the agency, in these court cases, it's look, it's something that it requires a fine art, because at the end of the day, I still am a relationship attorney, because even with all these lawsuits with these agencies, I still have a lot of clients that are seeking approval on things like that. So I can't be a total jerk. You have to do this in a very respectful fashion. And I really don't like to litigate unless we absolutely have to, because again, at the end of the day, I really just want the client to be successful. So if we can get a 60% win or a 70% win in lieu of litigation, that may be the perfected path, especially if they're going to have, things continuing on and on with this, regulator.
Last questions on this track is we've talked about your biggest career highlight. Do you feel like sharing what is maybe a loss or somewhere where you learned more than you won?
Okay, yeah. So I actually I have one. So this
Okay.
was very early in my career. I had a client that was seeking a declaratory statement from the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. We felt very strongly about our position and what we could do. And the agency, and then we were dealing with the secretary of the agency. He did not want to give my client everything that they wanted at that point in time.
Mhm, mhm.
And looking back, and that's part of as I was saying, sometimes you don't necessarily need 100% win. Sometimes you only need 60 or 70. And so we were offered a deal at that point, Sabrina, that looking back now, I wish we'd have taken, right? It would have been
Mm.
massive if we'd have been able to get what had been offered at that point in time. And I should have talked my client off of that ledge, but at the time, I was very confident in our legal position, and they were very confident in the legal position, and we just ran that train as far as we could, and unfortunately, we ran it right off the tracks, and we ended up with nothing at the end of the day. And so I try every time, when I lose, there's a lot of retrospect that you have to look into and figure out, you know, what caused that, what could you have done differently, how to mitigate those type of things. And so, looking back, I think about that one a lot, even now,
Yeah.
just randomly in issues, I'm like, man, what if I had have taken that initial offer that they had given us? What would things have looked like now? And it would have dramatically changed the gaming landscape in Florida from what it is today. But for whatever reason, I was a little too stubborn. I think I was a little young and a little too confident in myself. And so, you take those sometimes.
You learn.
Learn, that's right. You have to learn. You have to learn, you have to evolve, and that's what ultimately makes you better, and it makes you a better practitioner. It's the experiences I was talking to, in the middle. I mean, you just really you gain and you learn from these experiences, and that's ultimately what, makes you a better attorney at the end of the day.
How do you define lobbyist out of curiosity? This is a new question that's totally, but I've never asked anybody before, right? How would you define lobbying? Are you a lobbyist?
I don't necessarily think that I'm a lobbyist in the sense of how it's defined in Florida law, right? I don't necessarily
Good
go to the
answer.
legislature. And when I'm at the legislature, I'm generally as like a public policy expert. I'm going to testify on an issue. Sometimes lobbyists bring me along to meetings to help, educate someone on the subject matter that's at that. But, at the end of the day, I'm not pressuring people for votes at the legislature. And then, as it relates to, the executive branch, there's kind of an exemption for lawyers that are, pursuing approvals and things like that. So I don't really fall within that. A lot of people though consider to me to be a lobbyist, but at the end of the day, I'm just an attorney.
Just an attorney.
I'm just an attorney.
All right. Two more questions for you. Do you want the fun one or the scary one?
I'll take the scary one first.
What did your mom say when you told her that you were going to work in regulated cannabis?
You know, my mom has never given me grief about anything that I've done. So no issues whatsoever. I mean, I think I was a little concerned about that, what family might think, but, and again, growing up in rural Alabama, but my mom worked in the healthcare field. So I think, she was very familiar with a lot of, the stuff that was coming out about cannabis and how it was helping people and all. So yeah, there was really no grief at all with that.
That's wonderful. Not everybody has the same experience.
That is true. Yes. I
Any
can say I
regulatory?
had
Mm,
a attorney that worked for me one time whose family was very conservative. And what
mhm.
was funny is when I would see her dad, he would say that he does never mentions that his daughter practices cannabis law. She's a healthcare attorney and things like that. she was very funny and she enjoyed it. And she would correct her dad, like, I work in weed, Dad. That's what I do. And he would get very upset at family functions. He was like, shh, let's not tell people that. So
Perfect. I usually get two reactions. Don't tell people that, or don't forget to bring samples. It really just
yeah,
depends on the
yeah.
family member. Last question. What for our listeners, like you've talked a lot about the practice of lobbying as a regulatory attorney. We've talked a lot about how complex regulatory issues are. Just out of curiosity, what regulatory issues do you see popping up in the future? Considering everything that we've talked about today, what regulatory challenges might you consider popping up in the future?
Specific to cannabis.
Whatever.
Wow. I mean, it is ever evolving. I mean, we talked about gambling earlier. Right now, the evolving world of sweepstakes law, daily fantasy sports and sports betting, and also online gaming. That is the huge push now. I mean, 50 years ago, people got on a plane and they flew to Las Vegas. Now you get on your phone and you download an app and deposit money and away you go. That is really the trend, and people is
Gambling.
basically bringing the gambling into the households. So, almost every state legislature is dealing with that right now. With cannabis, I think the big debate is going to be, where does cannabis go in light of, the hemp CBD farm bill type products? Are states going to continue to regulate them differently? Do they ultimately merge into one? What's going to happen at the federal level? I think those are going to be. I was talking to someone today and they asked me, what's the odds of rescheduling happening in the next 60 days? And I said, probably pretty good. But in 2015, when I started, I think the entire industry felt like we were, a year or two away. This was happening. All these norms were, changing, and look at where we are now. It feels like that, other than some jurisdictions opening up, not a whole lot is really accomplished at the federal level. So we could still be talking about these same issues from 10 years from now, and very little progress could be made. But that's just the nature of regulated industries, and everybody's going to work to evolve within that.
Well, if you need some bombastic support, I would encourage you in the regulatory sector to call John Lockwood out of Tallahassee, Florida at Lockwood Law Firm, because he's the only one that's going to be able to help you get it done. If our guests wanted to find you, do they head to your website?
I'd
Send
say
you an
that's the
email?
easiest way to find me, is the lockwoodlawfirm.com. We don't really do any social media. I'm not very active on LinkedIn. I do have a LinkedIn profile. I just don't really post anything on there. But, that's generally it. I mean, I have a low profile generally.
And are you taking any hunting applications for partners in quail season? That's what we really want to know, is how do we get out to your farm and
You are
figure out?
certainly welcome for this quail
Anytime.
season if you would like to come down. It'd be wonderful. I'll have a horse reserved for you.
John, thank you so much for joining us today on Practical Politics. I hope our guests love learning about pinball and quail hunting and everything in between. Thank you so much, and we look forward to having you back on again soon.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining me today on Practical Politics. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Sabrina, your lobbyist lady, reminding you that every policy has a person behind it. Thanks for listening.